Hello everybody, this is Dr. Amir. Thank you for joining me in this second entry in the long-form study series. In this video, we're talking about George and autism. It's been speculated for a while that George is on the spectrum of autism, and whether you have scientific reasons for that belief, or you're making a gut call based off the way he kicks, there are many reasons to explore this topic further. And yes, how somebody moves can be an indicator of autism, as it can affect motor skills. Really, anytime GG has made a decision in his life that makes you go, what the fuck? It could be related to autism. So to start with an overview, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a developmental disability regarding differences in the brain. This is highlighted by problems with social communication and interaction and/or restricted or repetitive behaviors. Essentially, people afflicted have different ways of learning, moving, and/or paying attention. Someone could have ASD if they have noticeable, consistent difficulty with social interaction. We've certainly seen that a lot with George over the years. He has a lot of documented conversations where it does not go the way he intends it to, or he is surprised by the way it goes. So George has shown a long misunderstanding of why his interactions with people go poorly. Second, compulsively repeat behaviors or speech. We'll be going over that more later. I've built a list with the help of the goons for that. Unable to function in structural aspects of life, such as school or work. It's easy to wonder how George could have fallen so far. He had his father taking care of him for a bulk of his life, and then when his father passed, George suddenly had half a house and a lot of money, so much money that he was able to buy the second half of the house and still have a lot of money. So he found himself as an adult with a house and a lot of money, and he ended up losing both. It's easy for someone from the outside to look at that and say, how did that happen? But a person with autism being dropped into that self-reliant situation, it's certainly understandable to see how they could let that go to ruin. There are a few different types of ASD, just to gloss over real quick. First is autistic disorder, which is what I believe GG has. It's the original definition of autism. It's a more intense level of symptoms. You may hear it referred to as classic autism. There is also Asperger's. That's a term that you hear thrown around a lot. Asperger's is the milder end of the spectrum. People with Asperger's do show symptoms of autism, but they're mild enough that they are able to still successfully run their own daily lives, even despite the social challenges that they experience. And to talk a little bit about the spectrum, so some people's view of autism may be skewed. Even today, I think some people still view autism like that episode of South Park where Cartman pretends to have Down syndrome to enter the Special Olympics. The truth is, like a lot of psychological areas of study, autism is a spectrum. And FYI, Down syndrome is a genetic condition, not a subset of autism, just to be on the same page with everyone. A spectrum means there is a large variety of symptom combinations that may be applicable. There's no one checklist wherein you have to punch every item to qualify. And some symptoms are so common that a person can show signs without actually being on the spectrum. Because the spectrum is so wide, in this video I'm just focusing on symptoms that George displays, but that is a pretty long list, which is why I feel confident diagnosing him with autism. So, getting into these symptoms, first up, slow to respond to social cues or adjust to social situations. Biggest point here is this entire GG saga. George at no point in his documented history has responded to the trolls in a way that has benefited him. George at no point has shown any understanding of how to deal with trolls, how to respond to trolls. There are a lot of people on the internet who experience trolling, but it drops off pretty quickly, and it's just in the way that they respond. It's understanding the social situation, it's understanding other people, it's empathizing with other people and understanding why they're doing what they're doing and using that to measure your response. George at no point has been able to read the reason behind anybody trolling him, and I think that definitely plays a part in why he continues to be trolled so long after his original public access show has been canceled. In the Saunders calls, it's been brought up before, he exhibits a lot of moments where he's slow to respond or he doesn't respond at all. Saunders will say something, whether he's delivering information or making a crack at George's expense. Several seconds will pass by before George needs to tell Saunders to repeat what he said. I think Will gave the metaphor of you can hear the little gears turning in his head. A lot of those calls with Saunders, it feels like there's a lag between Saunders and George. George is always several seconds behind in processing the information, and so many times, some of my from an entertainment perspective, some of my favorite parts of the Saunders calls are when Saunders says something that insults George and he just doesn't catch it at all. George has a proclivity for arguing with kids. This is just another one of those weird aspects of Gorgeous George that are hard to understand. Like I said at the top of this video, these traits about George, these things he does that make you just go, how could somebody do that? Why is that happening? I think whenever you have a response like that to something George does, there's a chance that it's linked to autism and just the way George's brain is processing information. Going back to this point of not understanding social cues or social situations, George clearly just doesn't understand there are different rules for engaging with children. Kids, their brains are still developing. Even teenagers, their brains are still developing, especially socially. And George doesn't understand that, which is why he talks to kids and teenagers the exact way he talks to adults and trolls, and that paired with his narcissism, I think, is the perfect storm for what makes him rage at children. Next symptom, unable to understand another person's point of view or actions. So we're all well aware that George fails to show empathy for other people on a consistent basis. He failed to ever accurately read Jamie's point of view or actions, especially in light of the recent text messages. It's clear that Jamie had no desire to be in a relationship with George, and that's not something he was ever able to fully understand. That's clear in his response to her. George has also completely failed to empathize, understand the point of view of the Whalens. I know George has even received criticism from Saunders in calls for raging against the Whalens and wanting to start a lawsuit against the Whalens. George, even if he truly believes he has nothing to do with Jamie's death, the fact remains that they had a tumultuous relationship at the time of her death, and her family not knowing George personally gives them a lot of reason to be wary of George. I think that's a very simple concept for the average adult to understand. But George is completely unable to see that point of view, which is why it's so easy for him to go off on the family when they don't want a personal relationship with him or they express not the highest opinion of him. Next symptom, has little imagination. George, I think, exhibits this a lot. One area are his ruses. I think those pretty consistently lack creativity. The now famous Lisa Wallace ruse was pretty laughable. In trying to hide his history and involvement with Jamie from the world, he and Kristen cooked up a scheme where they would say this woman's name is Lisa Wallace, and as far as I can tell, that was the entirety of the plan. News came out about George knowing a girl who had died, so I think Kristen made a video about how that was her friend Lisa Wallace, and that was going to be the end of it. Nobody was going to Google search a Lisa Wallace. Nobody was going to look into it. And then there's my phone call with George, Roger, and Watt. George had previewed in a tirade video where he goes at Eugene the Magnificent and Boston and Ty, and he had said maybe Dr. Amir should analyze you all, and that was, a few days before our scheduled phone call. And during our phone call, it became clear to me that George and company wanted nothing more out of that interaction than having me vocalize their opinions of the trolls. So they asked me basic questions, I gave them my answers. The answers weren't what they wanted, so they went on rants explaining what they wanted the answer to be and hoping that I would just agree with them, and that would be that. When I didn't agree with their statements, I was called out for being fake and phony and a troll. And that ruse completely lacked any creativity. There was no deception to it, no layers to it. They asked me an open-ended question and were hoping just by the roll of a dice that I would say what they wanted to hear. But when I didn't, they stalled out and eventually just hung up. And also on imagination, Gigi has been accused of over the years of stealing bits for the Gorgeous George show from Saturday Night Live and other platforms. I've seen a few of the bits. They certainly lack artistic creativity and certainly seems to take a lot from some of the most famous improv platforms out there. Next symptom, a lasting, strong focus on specific details or interest. So George holds tight onto his trademark, which is interesting because it has no monetary value. He even stated in his own bankruptcy forms that it has no value, and that is accurate because the show has never made money for him, and it currently has no marketable value for any legitimate sponsor. Yet even somebody trying to use that trademark in any way, even parody, completely sets him off. He is very attached to that. He also has a lasting, strong focus on people. And this is despite their faults or feelings or adversary nature to George. People like Sue, Angela, Jamie, Matt, Roger. These are all people that have been contrary to George in one way or another, yet George keeps them at the forefront of his thoughts. While I certainly don't think autism is the main reason why he has stayed attached to these people for so long, I do think it plays a factor. Next symptom, irritability and having trouble regulating emotions. So George is in his 50s and he has a long list of trigger words. So many rants and tirades over the years have come from Saunders just mentioning one thing that George can't handle hearing. And George is so aware of it that in a lot of calls, he'll even warn Saunders not to say the trigger word. He'll warn him preemptively, don't set me off, don't make me mad. So George has certainly shown an issue with irritability over the years. Can't read body language. So George has a really hard time understanding how his co-hosts are feeling whenever he does do a Gorgeous George show, and I certainly think that plays into why those shows are so hard to watch and why he's just a bad host in general. Yeah, it's been mentioned how different Kevin is on the Gorgeous George show. Since Kevin does several other shows with other people, he seems to really flourish when he is with somebody who can at all empathize and read him. Whereas when he was with George, even in the latest show he uploaded a week or so ago, Kevin looks so static. He looks like he's boxed up, and he just looks annoyed. I know in the latest show, Kevin never made eye contact with George. Clearly, it's not something he's there to do with George as a friend. It's something he's there to do just to be on camera, maybe a little bit out of obligation for a long-time relationship. If George had begged him to be on the show, I would guess Kevin would have felt obligated. And then other co-hosts, Roger has long looked really anxious on the show, and that's not something I've seen George ever accurately read and do anything to kind of help Roger feel more comfortable in that situation. And there are just so many clips over the years from Gorgeous George shows where you can just tell by the body language of the person sitting next to George that they're completely uncomfortable. And you can see in the way George just continues to talk next to them that he has no idea how they're feeling. Next symptom, have difficulty multitasking. I remember in a call with Saunders, Gigi complained because he was talking to Saunders and then he went to the wrong house with a DoorDash order, and he complained that he couldn't read the house number. George is unable to talk, drive, and look at house numbers at the same time. I also remember my call with George, the second part of it when I called him back. The entire time through that call, you can hear the door beeping, his car door beeping. He had the car door open and keys in the ignition. So clearly he was about to get out of the car, about to go do something, and I called him and interrupted whatever he was going to do. And so he was on the phone for 15 minutes just talking to me. Whatever he was going to do when I called him, it completely stopped. And even just getting out of the car and closing the door, or if he was getting in the car and closing the door. Closing the car door, that simple action was not something George's brain was able to multitask and do at the same time that he's talking on the phone. Next, limit of interest. George himself said in the call with me that he has a boring life. I do not see many interest in his life as far as hobbies go. He spends his day door dashing and occasionally talks to Roger or Watt. A person with autism, while they may have a limit of interest, also the interests they do have are usually very strong. I think of George's obsession with karaoke as an example of that. That's just a really weird niche hobby for somebody to really get into, and I'm not saying it's weird to like karaoke, but just how much George tries to inject that into every aspect of his life. Angela said, and George admitted in a rebuttal, that when they were looking at opening a coffee shop, George was going to put karaoke in there, which vibe-wise, those are completely contrary items. That's just another WTF moment where you wonder, how could somebody think that it's a good idea to have karaoke in a coffee shop? Next symptom, difficulty expressing thoughts. This is where many GGisms come from, especially in the heat of the moment when George is on a tirade. He tries to vocalize what he's thinking, but it just comes out gargled and messed up and ill-formatted, and all of the funny little phrases that we have and make fun of George for stem from that. He's definitely shown he has a really difficult time properly expressing his feelings. And this bleeds into the next symptom, repeated unique phrases or repeated use of incorrect words. So with the goons' help, which I greatly appreciate, on Discord I asked for help building a list of what I'm calling GGisms, a list of things that we've heard from him multiple times over the years, of repeated unique phrases or incorrect words or phrases. So thank you everybody in the Goon community for participating in this. It was extremely helpful to build this list. I'm going to read through it now, and the words will be scrolling up. The word George says will be on the left side, and its intended meaning will be on the right. I want to make it clear that everything on this list, it's not like something George accidentally mispronounced one time. These are mispronunciations and repeated phrases that George has said on multiple different occasions, which is what makes it a symptom of autism. Anonymous, ball-headed, bank on that, bystander, black web, cabinus, cease communications, Chattanooga, clippages, couples have arguments, Dale Carnegie, defamation, denify, documentated, don't know me from the man in the moon, dronage, duster huffer, enigma, farce, get froggy and jump, egregious, gray matter, horse you came on, hospel, hospitality, genre, lose credibility, low, lurker, M&A, No teeth to stand on. Open Pandora's box. Orifice. O Sodom. Pretel. Racial. Recarnation. Ruse. Rub dongs with your daddy. Scornful bitch. Secede. Sewerging bill. Shaolin. Schizophrenic. Solentology. Sonomite. Space Mountain. Streamline. Sumskull. Susudio. This shit ends today. This shit is going to stop. Strategy. Vaudeville act. Vegetarian state. Virginia. Again, thank you to the goons for help with that. I could not have done it without you building that list. And the final symptom I want to talk about is a short-sighted viewpoint. So people with autism have trouble seeing the big picture or understanding big concepts. I think of George's life insurance plan. He was treating it like a 401k in those calls with Saunders where he talked about that. He believed that money was going in and that was something he would be able to pull out in his life. That obviously is not how life insurance works. Life insurance is insurance that covers somebody's life, believe it or not, and if that person were to die and it were the manner of death were covered under the insurance, then the next of kin would receive that money. George cannot be his own next of kin, and George cannot spend money after he's dead, so obviously there is no legitimacy to that plan. He also recently, in the most recent tirade video, he talked about starting a GoFundMe, and he says he's going to match donations, which I do not understand what the plan is there. I don't understand where his matching money is coming from. And I guess I'm saying that because I don't think George understands where that matching money is coming from. So if George has $100 in his bank account and he gets $100 in donations, if that $100 in donations just goes into that bank account and now he has $200 that he can use to pay a car bill, that's not matching donations. That's just taking money. If he legitimately has $100 in his bank account, gets $100 in donations, and then takes the $100 out of his bank account, combines it with the $100 in donations, and puts that towards resources for the Gorgeous George show, that would be a legitimate use of his GoFundMe plan, but I find that very hard to believe that is his intention, as he clearly has trouble with his day-to-day budget. I cannot imagine he has extra funds to be matching people's donations for a supplemental cause. Now I'd like to do something a little different. I'm going to be taking an online autism test for George. For any detractors, I imagine this is already raising some ethical flags, so I will give you my arguments for this. First, this is not an official diagnosis. This is just a free test. You can find many of them online to see if you possibly are on the spectrum of autism. but no matter what you score on a test, it does not definitively mean you have autism. It's just showing the level of symptoms you may exhibit and whether or not it merits you talking to someone professionally to be officially diagnosed. I'll be taking this test as George, and I will be giving my reasons for why I answer each question the way I do. George is a public figure, so I feel that I can do this. Anyone can get on these tests and take them for any public figure, celebrity, famous person that they want. And finally, this test, these results, it's not something that affects George's life directly in any way. It's not like the test results are something that appear on a permanent record. It's not as if someday George is going to apply for a loan and they're going to run a background check and say, oh, we see a Dr. Amir ran a autism quiz on you and you scored this, so we're going to have to deny you. That's not the case. This is just a starting point for someone interested in learning more about their connection with autism and the spectrum. So, here we go. I like to do things the same way. I'm saying most of the time because George seems to have a pretty set routine, and even he himself says that he lives a pretty boring life, just gets up and works. I would rather hang out alone rather than go to a party with friends. I'm going to say some of the time. For answers that I don't feel confident one way or the other, I'm sure I'll just go some of the time to keep middle of the road. I think George has exhibited a desire to do both in certain situations, whether he's partying with friends or just being alone. I tend to notice small details that others don't. I'm saying never for that. Now, never isn't never. This is just best answer, but George definitely does not notice little details in conversations. When I'm reading a story, I have a hard time imagining what the characters might look like or figuring out the characters' intentions. I'm saying most of the time for that because George has shown a lack of empathy for people in general. He has a hard time figuring out real people's intentions, so I don't imagine he'd be able to figure out characters' intentions. I find myself drawn more strongly to people than to things or solitary activities, including video games. I'm saying some of the time. George definitely can attach himself strongly to people, but not like mass groups of people, and not often. It's usually just a select few people. As he has said, he does seem to spend a lot of solitary time by himself. I enjoy social gatherings and or find social situations easy. I'm saying some of the time for that kind of middle of the road. Again, I do think he legitimately enjoys social gatherings when it's about him and in a very controlled situation. On many occasions, I've been told that what I've said is impolite, even though I think it is polite. Yeah, that happens a lot. We've heard it in calls that happens a lot. I frequently find it hard to keep a conversation going. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt and saying some of the time here. I would say it's accurate that he has a hard time keeping a productive conversation going. Just keeping a conversation going in general is doable because he just keeps talking, but having a back and forth healthy conversation is something that I do think he has a hard time doing. I find it difficult to imagine what it would be like to be someone else. Do I even need to explain that one? I focus more on the whole picture rather than the small details. I'm going never for that. George picks out small details in situations that, for whatever reason, are most important to him, and he completely loses sight of the whole picture while he focuses on that. That's part of the reason why it's so easy to run ruses on him. I tend to have very strong interest and get upset if I can't pursue them. That also is most of the time. Anytime George is blocked from doing something that he really wants to, he rages. That very strong interest usually applies to a woman, and he certainly does get upset if he can't pursue. When I talk, it isn't always easy for others to get a word in. Well, I have experience in that. That is very true. When someone is talking to me, I find it easy to read between the lines, understand their true feelings or intentions. I'm going never on that. This connects to a lot of what we've already answered in this test. George doesn't empathize. George has a hard time seeing the big picture, seeing people's intentions through the little details that he latches onto that apply to himself. I find it easy to understand what someone is thinking or feeling just by looking at their face. I'm going never with that. This goes back to George just having a lack of an ability in reading people's body language. I often notice small sounds when others don't. I'm going never, just because I've never seen him exhibit that. And again, as I mentioned earlier in my second phone call with George, where his door is beeping the whole time, that didn't seem to be something that he noticed at all. Not that that one situation is indicative of his entire ability to notice small sounds, but like I said, I've never seen an example where he notices a small detail like that isn't something that directly affects his life. Numbers, dates, or strings of information fascinate me. I'm going some of the time on this one just because I don't feel I know enough to answer definitively one way or the other. George doesn't have that cliche autistic nature of having a very mathematical mind, but at the same time, he has shown interest in dates that are important to him. Strings of information like a license plate number of an adversary is something that he can memorize, so I'm going to stay middle of the road for that one. I can easily recognize patterns in things all the time. That is never. He would not be easy to trick if that were so. He would learn lessons if that were so. New situations make me anxious and nervous. I'm going to go some of the time. I don't feel like I've studied George quite enough to definitively say where his anxiety level is at in new situations. With how well he can bumble a new situation, I think that certainly could stem from being nervous, but for now, that's just a middle of the road answer. I prefer reading books about non-fiction subjects like dinosaurs. I'm going to go most of the time, and my reason for this is that I just haven't seen any example of George reading fiction books. I know reading hasn't been a part of his history in general, but it's been long said that he really likes Bill Clinton's autobiography, so I would say that he does have a strong interest in the nonfiction genre. I find it hard to figure out people's intentions. There have been a lot of similar questions like that. Most of the time he definitely does. That is why so many of his conversations have gone south over the years, because he can't understand his counterpart's intention. So, George's score is a 22 out of 40. Scoring in this range means it may be a good idea to monitor your symptoms and keep track of the severity of these behaviors and when they are present. Further evaluation is typically recommended when these behaviors begin to interfere with your ability to navigate life, school, and relationships, which they definitely have in all three of those aspects of George's life. If you're concerned or want more information, consider scheduling an evaluation with a qualified healthcare or mental health professional for further assessment and potential treatment options. So yeah, essentially what this quiz is saying is George is exhibiting autism-like symptoms, enough so that if they are interfering with his life, it's something that he should see someone professional about and receive an official diagnosis, and from there can work on learning to live and cope with being on the spectrum. So a few common causes for autism, and there are a lot of causes, but what specifically relates to George could be just a genetic disorder, or in general, genes affecting the way his brain cells developed and learned to communicate with each other. Having older parents also has been a common cause in autism. If the mother is over the age of 35, it's considered a geriatric pregnancy, and it comes with elevated risk in development. Treatment for autism, there's medication that can help sort of stymie the most intense symptoms. Other than that, classes and counseling are always really helpful. For someone who has autism, the biggest challenge really is social interaction usually, and so group classes, group therapy can be hugely helpful in having a structured social interaction for the advantage of learning and being able to empathize with others. Well, that is my introduction on autism. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.